Hello, this is Taylor Ellwood, and welcome to the Magical Experiments podcast. Today, I'm going to talk about a topic that I've been sitting on for the last 6 years or so, since 2018. And it's a really interesting idea. It's all about how to use game creation to construct pop culture magical workings. And I'm sure other people have thought of it, but if they have, they haven't necessarily put it out there. And I've been sitting on it for the last 6 or so years, thinking about it and considering it, and also just exploring other topics. It's been a while since I've done a video on pop culture magic, so I thought, why not do it today? So whether we're creating a board game or a card game or a video game, any kind of game, there are specific principles of world building and that are important to that game, and there are specific rules that are important in order to create an experience with the game where a person can play and win, provided that they operate within the parameters of the game, and sometimes operate outside of the parameters of the game. It's important to understand this because it's a very distinct principle that really operates in the same way across our normal everyday lives and experiences. I mean, one of the reasons we play games is, in a very real sense, we are dealing with the simulation of life, and we're learning in that simulation how to interact with our world and turn it into a game. I mean, this is where gamification comes from. This is why, at some jobs they've gamified the work in order to quote unquote make it more fun. Because when people play a game, they're more inclined to be interested in the work. And I think it's an interesting approach and a manipulative approach to take toward life and other such aspects, but it clearly can work. I first came up with this idea around using game creation to construct pop culture magic workings, honestly, probably about 10 or 15 years ago. There was a game that I was playing called Infamous. It was Infamous 2, actually. And one of the features that the game developers released is that you could create your own missions. And they provided you a suite of tools in the game to do that. And these tools they were using these tools as a way, I suspect, to gather data from how people would construct games, but also maybe even potentially prime the pump for potential developers down the line for their video game. But it was an interesting exercise to actually explore, both from the front end, i.e. being the game player and playing different scenarios, and the back end, constructing specific scenarios. I've seen this replicate itself in several other games. So, for example, Assassin's Creed Odyssey gave you the same kind of tool suite. Well, not exactly the same kind of tool suite, but it gave you a tool suite that you could work with in order to construct specific boards or levels. And then, of course, you see this in general with like board games and storytelling games like D&D and things like that. You can create games out of those games. You can create specific levels. You can create specific experiences. One of the experiences that I enjoyed creating, I played for a while with, I had a Star Wars game that had figurines that could be used and played with, and I would construct those and set them up. So that was an example to me of this kind of principle of game creation to construct pop culture magic workings. And this is really important because we look at magical workings in general, we're not necessarily trying to gamify them, but we could. But we can also apply this to larger scale social movements, and that's just as essential with this kind of work. These larger scale social movements can show up in different ways. So like, your work environment, certainly, but it could also show up in terms of economic forums, political forums. You see it with memes and other aspects along those lines. One of the ways that I look at game creation is I think of game creation as creating a very distinct set of rules. The rules set up the parameters by which the game occurs, and they set up how you can win the game. However, the rules are just the most obvious form of the game. And you won't necessarily always follow the rules in order to accomplish your goals. The rules serve as a way to streamline the majority of how people will interact with a game. But not everyone will interact with that. Some people will have a meta realization and be able to navigate around the rules or do something else along those lines. They'll be able to get outside of the sandbox, as it were. Now, what I've looked at in regards to video games is creating very specific levels where a person can play, and as the person accomplishes the specific goals of the level, that level itself becomes a magical working. And every single time a person plays that level, they are basically casting the magical working that is associated. So what I'm doing is I'm building a magical working into the construction of the level and the setup. And the idea on a meta level is that a person will create or construct the magical working through that game creation, and then other people who play it will essentially cast the magical working for you. And the reason they'll do that is because they're going to perform that function. And let's be honest here, speaking as a video game player, really just a game player in general, when I play games, I'm emotionally and energetically invested in it. I'm intellectually invested in it. I want to win that game. So I'm putting a lot of energy, time, creativity, etc. into the game. And this is a really powerful understanding because that's a meta rule, if you will, of game creation. And it's one that's unsaid, but it's worth saying it and exploring it in relationship to constructing a magical working. So if I'm going to create a game level, whether it's a board game or a storytelling game or a video game or a mobile game or some other kind of game, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up specific magical objectives that are accomplished by the playing of that board, the playing of that game, and the winning of the game will achieve another set of objectives. So what happens is the magical working is cast regardless of whether or not the person wins. But if the person wins, they get the feeling of winning. You get the person who's doing the magical working through the game design gets the feeling of achievement as well, because essentially what's happening is that it's unlocking that spell even further and allowing it to go further. The reason I separate this out, though, is because there are going to be times where if somebody is playing a game, they're not going to win. You don't want that lack of winning to take away from the efficacy of the magical work. So the idea should always be built in that regardless of whether a person wins or loses, the magical working is achieved or is executed and sent out into the world. But if the person wins, then that winning contributes to the overall and amplifies the overall effect of the magical working. So every time somebody wins, it amplifies it. Now, for somebody who's tempted to do this, the one thing you have to keep in mind is you can't make the game too easy to win. There has to be a level of challenge. You want to invest people into the game. And if they're not invested, they're not going to if it's too easy, they're not going to play it. The whole point is to get people to play. So if you want people to play, you have to get them invested in the game. You have to get them to care about the game. You have to get them to want to play the game. You can apply this across the board on many different levels. This is a mimetic play. It is a play, with video games. It's a mobile, but it's a play across the board. It can be done, applied in real life as well. The important thing is that if you're going to play a game or set up and create a game for people to play, is that you make it hard enough that they have to work for it, but winnable enough that they can actually achieve it. That's an essential rule of this kind of work. If it's too hard, people aren't going to want to play it. And I think of this in regards to some of the games that I've seen out there where they're like super hard. Some people will play those games because they're masochistic and they really want to beat those games. Most people won't. And the reason they won't is because they don't really want to play if there's no chance of winning. I think of this, I liken this to playing, there was a game called, I think, from Sekiro or something like that. It was a ninja game. I played it for a while. It got to a point where I could not beat the game. I tried and I tried and I got very close, but I couldn't beat it. It was too hard. And I just gave up because it was a frustrating experience. And I didn't want to play a game that much and put that much effort into it and not be able to succeed. It was a valuable lesson for me that don't invest my time in games that I can't necessarily win. And so I don't anymore. Like, I'm very picky about the games that I play, but B, make it so that a game is winnable. And the people who developed that game from Sekiro, the people that developed that game would probably argue it is winnable. But I would argue that they made it so hard, and they did that because they were trying to go for a specific niche of people, and that's okay. But from a magical perspective, I would consider that to be a huge waste and an inefficient approach to that kind of, if you're trying to do this for magical purposes. So the most important thing about this kind of work is that you really want to consider the overall goal of your magical working, and you want to think about like how the achievement of specific objectives in the game builds up to and allows you to execute the overall magical working. So for example, I might have it that if a person achieves objective A, by accomplishing objective A, they have charged the magical working up this much. And that charge can, even if they don't go any further than that, that charge can be released and directed toward accomplishing the magical working. But if they continue to play, then it goes up to objective B, and objective B might be it activates a specific subfeature of the magical working in order to accomplish something else. This is basically auto magic when you think about it. It's doing magic on where you're setting the magic up, and then you're just continually casting it again and again and again through other people's efforts. And this is something I've done before with some of my magical workings, because I'm fascinated by the way that people invest themselves in the world. And I pay attention to that. And I think it's a really efficient way of utilizing magic. Look at how people pay attention to and do specific activities, what they invest their attention and intention and other such things toward, and you can unlock the doors of the universe. So this is just a thought out there that I'm putting out there. It's something that I've worked on. I don't know if I'll ever end up ultimately writing about it or not. So I kind of figured I would share it today in the hopes that if someone ever decides that they want to execute on it, they can. I have executed on it myself, but it's one of those cases where, like, I don't know if I'll ever write another book on pop culture magic. I've kind of written what I needed to write. Or if I do, it's going to go if I do write another book, I couldn't incorporate this idea. But you heard it here first, folks, and try it and let me know what you think.